Richard had a claim to the throne, that it was not necessary for him to kill the princes, the sons of Edward IV, to take the throne.
For over 5 centuries, historians believe the fate of Edward V and his brother, Richard, Duke of York, the lost princes in the Tower, was sealed by their uncle, King Richard III. But nobody expected this stunning revelation. A new discovery has surfaced, one that Philippa Langley, the historian who found Richard III remains beneath a Leicester car park, claims has just solved King Richard III's role in the Princes in the Tower mystery. The evidence uncovered across European archives and the National Archives in London could rewrite what we know about one of Britain's most haunting historical enigmas, or expose just how deep the mystery still runs. The mystery that wouldn't die. Few stories in English history have inspired as much debate, speculation, and sorrow as the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. Their story begins in the spring of 1483 when their father, King Edward IV, died unexpectedly, leaving the crown to 12-year-old Edward. Before he could be crowned, however, events took a sinister turn. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, swiftly took control of the government, arrested Edward's maternal relatives, and placed the boy king in the Tower of London, then a royal residence, not yet the grim prison it would become. Soon after, Richard also took custody of the 9-year-old Duke of York, supposedly to prepare him for his brother's coronation. But that coronation never happened. Instead, Parliament declared Edward IV's marriage invalid, rendering all his children illegitimate. In July 1483, Richard of Gloucester was crowned King Richard III. Within weeks, both princes vanished from sight. No official announcement was made, no bodies were displayed, and no one outside the Tower ever saw them again. From that moment, suspicion clung to Richard III like a shadow. Rumors spread that he had ordered the murder of his nephews to secure his hold on the throne. Chroniclers such as Dominic Mancini, who was in London that very summer, reported that the young king sought remission of his sins daily, as if aware death was nigh. By autumn, even their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had abandoned hope and aligned herself with Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, the man who would eventually defeat Richard at Bosworth in 1485 and become Henry VII. The Tudors, eager to justify their new dynasty, cemented Richard's image as a ruthless usurper. Shakespeare's later portrayal of him as a scheming villain with a twisted spine only deepened that perception. Yet despite centuries of condemnation, no direct evidence has ever surfaced proving Richard ordered their deaths. 2 small skeletons found under a stairway in the Tower in 1674 were long believed to be the princes, but no DNA analysis has ever confirmed it. The truth, it seemed, had vanished into the same darkness that swallowed the boys. And yet, the case refused to close. From Victorian scholars to modern Ricardians, the question persisted: were the princes really murdered, or did they somehow survive? It's this unending mystery that drew Philippa Langley back into the story, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. When Langley first entered the public eye in 2012, she was an independent researcher chasing what many thought was an impossible dream: the lost grave of King Richard III. Her discovery beneath a Leicester car park stunned the world, reshaping how modern history could merge forensic science, archival research, and sheer determination. But for Langley, finding Richard's remains wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of another one even more elusive. For centuries, the mystery of the missing princes had haunted historians, novelists, and royal biographers alike. Langley believed the truth hadn't yet been found because researchers had been looking in the wrong places. While others searched for clues in English records, many of which were destroyed or doctored in the turbulent Tudor years, she turned her attention abroad. She suspected that evidence might survive in the archives of Europe, untouched by Tudor censorship and propaganda. Her new investigation would become known as the Missing Princes Project, a vast network of more than 300 volunteers spread across the continent. Each participant combed through dusty archives, forgotten ledgers, and family papers from Burgundy to Austria, hoping to find even a trace of the boys' existence after 1483. What they uncovered, Langley claims, changes everything. In late 2024, Langley and barrister Rob Rinder presented their findings in a Channel 4 documentary titled The Princes in the Tower, The New Evidence. Released alongside Langley's book, The Princes in the Tower, Solving History's Greatest Cold Case, the documentary promised groundbreaking revelations. She declared that a series of overlooked European documents, receipts, contracts, and first-person statements proved that both princes survived Richard III's reign. Central to Langley's argument is her assertion that this new discovery has just solved King Richard III's role in the Princes in the Tower mystery. Far from being a murderer, she argues Richard may have sent his nephews to safety amid the political chaos of 1483. In her view, the documents point to a deliberate act of protection rather than execution. The claim is bold, some say too bold, but it reignited a national debate. Did the man vilified for centuries as a child killer actually ensure his nephew's survival? Langley's detractors argue that her conclusions overreach, that her evidence is intriguing but far from definitive. Still, the discovery's timing, detail, and scope make it impossible to dismiss. As one reviewer noted, Langley has done what few historians have managed in modern times, forced the world to re-examine a 540-year-old mystery. Whether she has truly solved it or merely reopened it is the question that many have been left pondering. The first major clue in Langley's investigation came from an unlikely source, a yellowed financial record tucked away in the archives of Lille, northern France. At first glance, it seemed an ordinary 15th-century receipt, a request for long pikes ordered for soldiers serving the Duchess of Burgundy. But when Langley's team examined the faded handwriting more closely, they noticed something extraordinary. The document stated that these weapons were being provided for the son of King Edward who was expelled from his dominion. For Langley, this was the moment that changed everything. She believes the son of King Edward referenced in the 1487 receipt was none other than Edward V, the elder of the missing princes. According to her interpretation, the record shows that European powers, specifically Margaret of Burgundy, the prince's aunt, were supporting a living claimant to the English throne for years after the boys disappeared. If true, it would mean that at least one of the princes had survived Richard III's reign and escaped abroad. The receipt's timing fits perfectly with another major event, the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion of 1487. Officially, this uprising was led by a young boy claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick. But the new document complicates that story. Langley argues that early confusion over the rebel's identity, whether he was Warwick, Richard, or Edward V, may not have been confusion at all. She suggests that the Continental supporters truly believed the boy they were funding was Edward V himself, fighting to reclaim his throne. Not everyone is convinced. Many historians interpret the receipt differently. They note that the wording could easily refer to another of Edward IV's sons, possibly Arthur Plantagenet, the king's illegitimate child, or even to a clerical mistake by the scribe. Others suggest the reference might simply reflect the early chaos of the Simnel conspiracy, when supporters abroad still hadn't settled on which Yorkist figurehead to back. Critics also point out that if Edward V were alive and preparing for war in 1487, more evidence would surely exist: letters, payments, or royal decrees. Instead, the historical record goes silent. The document, they argue, proves only that a claimant believed to be Edward V was active in Europe, not that the real prince survived. Yet Langley remains steadfast. The Lille receipt, she insists, offers the first tangible sign that Richard III's supposed victims may have lived beyond the tower. Whether it reflects a secret rescue orchestrated by the king or simply the persistence of Yorkist loyalty, it's the spark that reignited the centuries-old mystery and led to the next, even stranger discovery. If the Lille receipt hinted at survival, the next discovery seemed to speak in the voice of the prince himself. In the archives of Gelderland, a province in the Netherlands, Langley's team uncovered a Middle Dutch document unlike anything ever seen in the Princes in the Tower case, a supposed first-person account of life after the Tower, written by none other than Richard, Duke of York. The manuscript, copied in a late 15th century hand, describes the younger prince's experience from his imprisonment in 1483 to his movements across Europe over the following decade. It claims Richard was secretly removed from the Tower by two men loyal to his uncle, identified as Henry and Thomas Percy, and taken out of England under an assumed identity. According to the text, he was spirited through France and Portugal, eventually finding refuge in Ireland, where several lords recognized him as Edward IV's son. The account concludes with him arriving in Burgundy under the protection of his aunt, Margaret of York. If genuine, the implications would be monumental. The timeline aligns closely with that of Perkin Warbeck, the mysterious figure who emerged in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. The manuscript appears to merge seamlessly with Warbeck's own movements, his time in Ireland, his recognition by Margaret of Burgundy, his audiences with King Maximilian, and his later attempts to claim the English throne. Langley views the Gelder's document as a missing puzzle piece. To her, it explains how Richard escaped, where he went, and why he reappeared in history disguised as a pretender. She believes it substantiates what she calls the survival narrative, that both princes lived on, and that Perkin Warbeck was no impostor but the genuine Duke of York. Historians, however, are far less convinced. The document's provenance is weak. It's not an original, but a later copy, and no one knows when or how it entered the archive. The handwriting and language date it broadly to the late 15th century, but that only confirms it's old, not authentic. Critics argue that the account reads like a piece of propaganda, likely crafted by Warbeck's supporters to strengthen his claim. The inconsistencies are difficult to ignore. Why would Richard III go to the trouble of capturing his nephews only to secretly release one into the hands of foreign nobles? Why would those involved risk exposure by committing such a story to paper? And if the prince truly lived abroad for a decade, why is there no corroborating mention in any English source of the time? Still, even skeptics admit that the Gelder's manuscript is fascinating. Its detail, tone, and alignment with real historical events are compelling enough to keep the debate alive. To believers, it feels like the long-lost voice of a silenced child king. To critics, it's an elegant forgery from a turbulent age. Either way, it deepens the central question at the heart of this new discovery that just solved King Richard III's role in the Princes in the Tower mystery. If this document is real, then Richard III was not a murderer, but a protector. Following the discoveries in Lille and Gelderland, Philippa Langley's investigation turned toward the courts of Europe, where even more perplexing evidence awaited. Among the treasures unearthed by her team were two remarkable documents, one from Austria, another from the Royal Archives in Dresden. Both appeared to confirm that years after the prince's disappearance, powerful figures across Europe were corresponding not with an impostor, but with someone claiming royal legitimacy as Richard, Duke of York. The Austrian document records a meeting between the self-proclaimed Duke of York and Emperor Maximilian I, then King of the Romans. Written by one of Maximilian's clerks, the account states that Richard proved his identity by pointing out three physical marks, one near his eye, one on his mouth, and one on his thigh. This, Langley argues, was a deliberate effort to demonstrate authenticity, suggesting that Richard III's nephew bore distinctive features remembered from childhood at court. The second document, found in Dresden and dated the 4th of October, 1493, is even more intriguing. It is a formal contract in which Richard of England promises Duke Albert of Saxony 30,000 florins in return for military support to regain his rightful throne. Attached to the contract is a beautifully crafted seal bearing the arms of England and the confident signature Richard of England. Langley's team had the parchment examined by experts in handwriting, ink composition, and paper watermarking, all of which confirmed it to be genuinely from the late 15th century. To Langley, this was the most compelling proof yet. If this man were merely Perkin Warbeck, a pretender raised by foreign powers, it seems extraordinary that such well-connected monarchs and nobles would treat him as royalty, signing formal agreements and investing resources in his cause. The documents, she claims, show that Europe recognized him as the real Richard, Duke of York. But historians remain cautious. They acknowledge the documents are authentic in date, but question their meaning. For one, no contemporary English account refers to any physical marks on the young prince, raising doubts about the Austrian description. And as experts like David Pilling point out, medieval diplomacy was a cynical game. Maximilian and Duke Albert stood to gain politically and financially by backing a Yorkist claimant, real or fake, who might destabilize Henry VII's rule. Supporting a pretender was simply a good strategy. Furthermore, as critics note, the confident handwriting and grand seal on the Dresden document do not prove identity. Anyone with the right resources could forge royal insignia. Pretenders throughout history, from Lambert Simnel to Warbeck, used similar tactics to bolster their legitimacy. Even so, the combination of verified dates, consistent claims, and official signatures gave Langley's argument new force. To her, these European papers represent a coordinated network recognizing Richard's survival, a picture of a prince not murdered in the Tower, but living, traveling, and bargaining for his throne. Whether history agrees or not, this evidence intensified the debate over King Richard III's true role in the Princes in the Tower mystery. Just when it seemed Philippa Langley's European discoveries had reached their limit, a new discovery in England added an unexpected twist, one that some believe could directly link Richard III's circle to the missing princes themselves. It came from the National Archives in London, where Professor Tim Thornton of the University of Huddersfield uncovered a striking entry in a 1516 will. The document, written more than 3 decades after the princes vanished, mentioned a precious possession belonging to the elder boy, Edward V. The will belonged to Lady Margaret Capel, half-sister of Anne Tyrrell, the wife of Sir James Tyrrell, a trusted knight of Richard III. Within its faded Latin text, one line stood out: "I bequeath to my son Sir Giles his father's chain, which was young King Edward VS." In modern English, "I leave to my son Sir Giles his father's chain, which once belonged to young King Edward V." The implications are staggering. If true, this means that a personal item belonging to Edward V was in the possession of Sir James Tyrrell's family decades after the boy's disappearance. Tyrrell, of course, is infamous in Tudor history as the alleged murderer of the princes, a charge that originated with Sir Thomas More's history of King Richard III. Yet More's account, written long after the events, has long been dismissed by some historians as Tudor propaganda designed to blacken Richard's name. So what does this newly surfaced will tell us? For Langley, the answer is clear. The presence of Edward VS chain in Tyrrell's family possessions suggests direct contact with the prince, not his corpse. If Tyrrell or his relatives owned the boy's personal belongings, it could mean they were tasked with protecting him, not executing him. In Langley's eyes, this new discovery just solved King Richard III's role in the Princes in the Tower mystery. Far from being a murderer, Richard may have entrusted his nephews to loyal hands like Tyrrell's to keep them safe from political enemies. But experts urge caution. Professor Thornton, who first published the find in the Historical Journal, noted that while the will is authentic, its implications are murky. How Tyrrell's family came to possess Edward's chain remains unknown. It could have been a gift, a trophy, or even plunder from the Tower. Sean Cunningham of the National Archives described it as a new piece of evidence that raises more questions than it answers. Nevertheless, the discovery electrified historians and the public alike. A tangible object, something that had once belonged to the lost prince, had resurfaced after 5 centuries. Whether it proves survival or simply deepens the tragedy depends entirely on how one interprets the evidence. But as Langley sees it, the Capel will is not just a historical curiosity. It's the missing link that finally clears Richard III's name. By the time Philippa Langley unveiled all 5 pieces of evidence, the Lille receipt, the Gelder's manuscript, the Austrian record, the Dresden contract, and the Capel will, her conclusion was bold and unmistakable. Taken together, she argued, these documents formed a coherent story that had eluded historians for half a millennium. Edward V, she claimed, was not murdered in 1483 but survived long enough to lead the Yorkist rebellion at Stoke Field in 1487. His younger brother Richard, she believes, lived into the 1490s, known to history as the man English chroniclers called Perkin Warbeck. In Langley's view, this new discovery just solved King Richard III's role in the Princes in the Tower mystery, not as the villain of Tudor legend, but as the uncle who saved his nephews from certain death. Nobody expected this sweeping reinterpretation of one of England's oldest crimes. According to Langley, Richard III secretly ordered the removal of the princes from the Tower to protect them from Yorkist enemies and Tudor sympathizers. The Lille receipt, she argues, documents Edward's presence in Europe 4 years later. The Gelder's text captures Richard's escape and exile. The Austrian and Dresden papers show his recognition by European rulers. And the 1516 Capel will proves that someone close to Richard retained a personal connection to the princes long after. For her, the cumulative weight of these clues points to one conclusion: they lived. Yet for every supporter who calls Langley's theory groundbreaking, some historians call it inconclusive. Tracy Borman, David Pilling, and others praise her archival tenacity but stress that evidence of existence is not the same as proof of survival. To them, these documents demonstrate the persistence of Yorkist claimants, not the resurrection of lost kings. Many also caution that forgery and mistaken identity were rampant in 15th century politics. Pretenders like Warbeck were supported precisely because they seemed plausible. Pilling goes further, arguing that Langley's approach risks inverting the same bias she criticizes in Tudor historians. If we condemn Tudor propaganda, he notes, we must avoid creating Ricardian propaganda in reverse. To him and many others, the most likely explanation remains the simplest. The princes were murdered quietly in 1483, their deaths covered up, and the subsequent pretenders, however convincing, were opportunists backed by foreign powers eager to destabilize Henry VII. Even Langley concedes that her discovery may not satisfy every skeptic. What she offers, she says, is not final proof, but a reframed understanding. Her evidence may not end the debate, but it undeniably shifts its center of gravity. For centuries, Richard III's reputation rested on one untested assumption, that he murdered the princes. Now, at the very least, that assumption has been challenged. Whether the world accepts her conclusions or not, Langley has ensured that the question is no longer if the princes survived, but how far they got before history buried them again. Over 5 centuries after 2 boys vanished behind the stone walls of the Tower of London, the mystery of the princes in the Tower still refuses to rest. Philippa Langley's new discoveries have reignited the debate in a way few could have predicted. Her findings have not only reopened the historical record but also reminded the world how fragile truth can be when filtered through politics, power, and time. Public fascination with the prince's fate endures precisely because the story sits at the crossroads of history and emotion. It's a tale of innocence, betrayal, and the shadow of propaganda that shaped Britain's national identity. Every new discovery, every re-evaluation forces society to confront how much of what we know is really just what we've been told. Langley's evidence, letters, seals, receipts, and wills, may or may not prove survival, but it challenges the idea that the past is settled. Calls have grown for modern scientific testing of the supposed prince's remains interred in Westminster Abbey since 1674. DNA analysis could, in theory, confirm whether the bones belong to Edward and Richard, or reveal an entirely different story. Yet even this prospect divides opinion. Some view it as the final step toward truth. Others see it as disturbing sacred ground. In many ways, the reluctance mirrors the deeper conflict between certainty and mystery, a tension that has defined this story since the 15th century. For Langley, the case remains personal. She has often said she's less interested in rewriting history than in uncovering neglected evidence and giving the past a fair hearing. Whether she has achieved that or not, her work ensures the princes are no longer silent victims of legend, but active figures in an ongoing investigation, one that continues to evolve with every new discovery. Do you think these new discoveries really solve King Richard III's role in the Princes in the Tower mystery? Or has the search for the truth only just begun?